going to try to sum up, my experience going through this material with one image. This is it. This is really, really shocking. This is a very recently, earlier this month. This is one of the longest rivers in Europe, the Loire River, and this is what it looks like right now. You can walk across the Loire River, and believe me, that has never happened before in recorded memory. So just think about that and any implications there. Traditionally, we always start off here taking a look at where are we with atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the main indicator for this is the observations made in May, when you have the growing season beginning and benchmark for carbon dioxide at a time when some of that's being absorbed by expansion of plant life on the Earth's surface. So we this past May hit 421 parts per million, and that is absolutely a record, and that's compared to 315 as recently as 1958 when these measurements first started being made. This is an increase of 1.8 parts per million just since last May, and I think more importantly, we're now 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. In that context, carbon dioxide levels were consistently around 280 parts per million for basically 6,000 years of human civilization. And now we have ventured into territory that we haven't seen. And this is coming from NOAA scientists, okay? This is not coming from your local tabloid. We're now venturing into territory that we haven't seen for 4 million years. Just wrap your heads around that fact. And here's what the graph looks like from 1958 right up through June 2022. It's almost hard to believe. It's just so mathematically consistent. Obviously, looking at geometric change here, and that's not a good thing, to say the least. And just imagine what it's like to be one of the senior scientists at NOAA, looking at this data and just wondering, how do you convey the severity of the situation? And one of them recently has said, asked the question, what's it going to take to wake us up? Here we are at levels our species has never experienced before, and yet after decades of negotiation, we're still unable to significantly slow, never mind reverse, these annual increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's, we're growing by an average of 2.4 parts per million per year. So as I said, there was an increase of 1.8 over the last year, but looking at the last several decades, it's averaged out at 2.4. And over the last 60 years, the rate of increase has basically been 100 times faster than when the last ice age ended. So just trying to get a picture here of just how unprecedented the world is that we have entered at this point. Looking at land and ocean temperatures, you can see that on this map, the extent to which most of the world was much warmer than average or record warmest in July. And July actually turned out to be the sixth warmest July in 140 years of NOAA record keeping. The land and ocean surface temperatures last month were about 1.57 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average. And the predictions are that when we get to the end of 2022, it'll definitely rank among the 10 warmest years on record. This is the 46th consecutive July where temperatures have been above the 20th century average. And our 5 warmest Julys on record have all occurred since 2016. So the trend is pretty clear in terms of what the situation is at this point. And I've made this a part of the presentation over the last few years, just because I think Van Jones really frames this in a very clear, concrete way. We have basically 3 alternative futures facing us. These are the choices: eco-apocalypse, eco-apartheid, or eco-equity. And what Jones says, I think it's really important to comprehend, is that eco-apartheid is just a speed bump on the way to eco-apocalypse. We, in the end, cannot wall off the global developments that are taking place, despite how much folks may want to do that. So in a sense, eco-equity is really our only viable road forward. But what does climate apartheid look like? And I think the most dramatic expression of it is the fact that, and this is according to the United Nations, developing countries are going to be bearing 75% of the climate crisis costs, and yet the poorest half of the world's population is responsible for just 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And there's just absolutely no question that extreme weather events in 2022 have had a devastating impact on food security in these developing nations. Many of our major food production regions are under severe stress from a combination of factors. I mean, they're beyond these events like heat waves, wildfires, droughts, and floods. Basically, these events have combined with the war in Ukraine and COVID pandemic circumstances, so that they're really compounding one another. COVID, of course, has been responsible for a lot of supply chain disruption, but the combination of these different factors has really been devastating. And there's been a dramatic drop in agricultural output that's driven up commodity prices and basically created what is now a global food crisis. And unfortunately, it's reversed years of progress that were being made in reducing hunger and poverty. So this is, I think, absolutely as I said, the most dramatic expression of what you can call climate apartheid. And we're essentially at a now or never moment. The IPCC issued a report in April that made it clear that if we want to stay under 1.5 degrees centigrade, our greenhouse gas emissions absolutely have to peak by 2025. And the report warned that without really immediate and deep reduction in emissions, we're going to rise more than 3 degrees. And that will be absolutely catastrophic. What really struck me about the release of this report is the harshness of the rhetoric from the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres, who dropped all pretense of being diplomatic in the speech he gave accompanying this report's release. And I think it really summed up in this quote, basically saying government and business leaders are lying, and no two ways about it, cutting through the fog and basically saying the results are going to be catastrophic here if this line continues. So trying to pick out amidst this sort of flood of news about climate change and the climate emergency, really wanted to share what I see as the real sobering climate news of the
Good dogs.
and I got to figure out how to. There, okay. That'll solve that problem. And I don't know, my sense is that this hasn't been front and center in the news. But what's going on out there in terms of release of methane gas, I think is really pretty terrifying, actually. And it's, I think, one of the most important questions facing the planet. Why is there so much methane in the atmosphere at this point? Now, researchers did note the uptick in methane emissions about 15 years ago. And the assumption then was that it was expanded natural gas production responsible, primarily fracking. And there's no question that fracking has played a role here and the leaks from the natural gas pipelines. But the fact is that methane emissions have increased in record rates in the last 2 years. And at a time when we're going through this pandemic, and there's some sense that we shouldn't be seeing this kind of really accelerating rate of emissions because of the pandemic. And as scientists looked at this issue and were carrying out tests in the labs, they were picking up a decline in the isotopes that really identify the methane being produced by natural gas production, and really made it clear to these scientists that sources other than fossil fuel extraction were growing in importance. And this was really startling to me when I started looking at the reports around this. But it's clear that both natural and human cause factors are at work here. You got wetlands, you got cattle raising, you got landfills, wildfires, thawing permafrost. And actually, it looks like the most intense growth right now is coming from the tropics, in part because of the wetlands, in part because of the wildfires, many of them set by humans to carry out cattle raising. And scientists are becoming deeply concerned about what looks like at this point a climate feedback loop. And that's when the planet, as it gets warmer, emits more methane naturally, which then drives temperatures up further, which then, of course, leads to increases in more methane emissions. And most recently, and this is really just a study that just came out, it looks like, in fact, methane is far more sensitive to global warming than scientists previously thought. So in other words, it's global warming itself is driving methane emissions at much greater rates than had been assumed. So the close runner-up to this is the fact that we have a global water crisis rapidly emerging as a result of climate change, and the essence of this is that the world is running out of water. The situation, I think, captured by this photograph of the drought in Australia currently. We now have over 3.5 billion people living in areas where water is scarce. And the projections are that this will increase to more than 5 billion people by 2050. And part of what's happening here is that rates of groundwater withdrawals are exceeding the rates of replenishment in over half of the world's major aquifers. And the aquifers, of course, are the major sources of fresh water, and so the drawdown on these aquifers is really been reaching critical levels, and it's not just droughts, but also floods that have made it much more difficult to manage water resources. And the World Economic Forum just issued a report that really called on corporations to take responsibility for the ways in which they've been responsible for these critical water shortages. And the World Economic Forum, of course, is dominated by corporations, and its primary audience is the corporate world. So this I found particularly striking, where it's actually talked about this climate emergency and the extent to which the water shortages are occurring, and the extent to which the corporate world in particular is not scaling up to address this issue sufficiently. Another report that came out it revealed that we're looking at agricultural water scarcity worsening significantly in more than 80% of the world's croplands by 2050. More than 80%, which, in my mind, raised questions about the impact on the Finger Lakes region, and just the extent to which it's going to become increasingly important as a resource for crop production. So just zeroing in on some of the key extreme weather events that have taken place recently, really striking to see this record heat wave in China. It's probably the worst in at least 60 years. There have been 2 months of really extreme heat in many parts of China in July and August. It's still ongoing. Temperatures in Sichuan province hit 113 degrees Fahrenheit on August 18th. That's the highest ever recorded in China outside of the country's desert region. Rivers in particular are at historic lows. 66 rivers have dried up completely in China. There are water levels in parts of the Yangtze River that are lowest since records began in 1865. And Yangtze, of course, is one of the primary shipping routes for the Chinese economy. And in some places, they're now trucking in drinking water to supply local villages. And last week, for the first time in 9 years, China announced a national drought alert. There are now rolling blackouts and factory shutdowns across the country. And this isn't something we're isolated from. Again, going back to this point about the eco-apocalypse just being a speed bump. We're not facing rolling blackouts and factory shutdowns here, for example, in upstate New York. But this situation is going to have a huge impact on the Chinese economy, and in turn will have a very dramatic impact on the world economy moving forward. So a really critical situation here. Turning closer to home, the mega drought in the U.S. West continues. I talked last August about how the mega drought in the West it was the worst in 500 or 600 years. Well, the latest study that came out in February found that it's now the worst mega drought in at least 1,200 years, and that it's human-caused climate change that's the significant driver here. Here's a really shocking photo of Lake Mead in July. This is a drought that's continued now for 22 years. It's reduced water supplies dramatically. It's devastated farms and ranches. It's helped fuel wildfires throughout the West. Just to focus on California for a moment, right now, nearly 3/4 of California is in either extreme or exceptional drought. That's worse than severe. Okay, we're talking about extreme or exceptional drought. 3/4 of California. More than 660 wells have gone dry so far this year. And I'm not talking about backyard wells here. I'm talking about most of these wells being the San Joaquin Valley and being one of the major ways in which crop production is made possible. And Lake Mead and Lake Powell, according to a UN report, a very recent report, is basically stating that these two largest reservoirs in the US are approaching what's called dead pool status. And that's when reservoirs are no longer able to generate hydropower because there's basically no water flowing. And it's really created a political crisis in the sense that the states involved with this, there are 7 states that really depend on these reservoirs for water source, have been unable to agree on water cuts. And so just in the last couple of weeks, the federal government has stepped in and threatened to step in and impose restrictions. And this would be the first time ever if that actually takes place, which it looks like it will. Looking across the Atlantic, there have just been massive wildfires and basically 4 times the 15-year average this summer. You're looking at Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, France, and Germany, losing over 1.6 million acres to wildfires by early this month. And the fire season still has over 4 weeks to go, but it's already the 2nd largest area consumed on record. On top of that, and partially because of it causing this record-breaking heat wave in Europe has dried up many of the rivers. You saw the photos that I started out with the Loire River, but also the Rhine, the Danube. I mean, they're dredging the Danube right now in Serbia. The headwaters of the Thames have dried up to the extent that you can walk across it. And the Rhine, of course, is really a major artery for transportation of goods and supplies in Europe. And many parts of that have become impossible to pass without offloading a significant percentage of the freight so they can make it through these shallow areas. This last July was the driest ever in England since 1911. Only 24% of the expected annual rainfall, average rainfall, took place in England in July. And then moving on to South Asia, there have been devastating floods in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh this year. This you can see here in this image the aftermath of flooding in Pakistan. India faced record-breaking heat wave in spring. That was followed by flash floods and landslides, primarily in the northwest of India this past summer. Pakistan also experienced just a terrible spring heat wave. And in fact, the world's highest temperature was hit in May. Just again, wrap your heads around this, 129 degrees Fahrenheit in the village of Terbat, the world's highest ever recorded. And then that was followed by torrential rains that triggered floods that have killed more than 900 people so far this summer. And according to the UN, so this isn't hyperbole, 2.3 million people have been affected in Pakistan because of these floods, and over 95,000 homes destroyed. As we all know, there are all kinds of crises taking place in Afghanistan, where the economy has basically come to a standstill. And on top of that, earlier this month, flash floods took place across Afghanistan that have really had a severe effect, and many homes destroyed or damaged and thousands of families affected. So we're all aware of the fact that climate scientists have predicted for years that global warming was going to lead to more extreme weather. I mean, that's not a surprise. But what is a surprise is how much faster this is hitting than expected, as I said at the outset. The IPCC report released in February actually concluded that at this point, more than 40% of the world's population is now living in places that are, quote unquote, highly vulnerable to climate change. That's 40% of the world's population. And I think most dramatically, the report really underscored the extent to which greenhouse gas emissions are rising so rapidly that they're actually in danger of outstripping the ability of many communities to adapt. So this understanding that, you know, we can stave off most of this through mitigation measures is really becoming a very challenging issue. And, you know, there's a Robert Frost poem that basically says, the only way out is through. And I think that's especially true in thinking about what we need to do in terms of climate action. It's crystal clear that rapid decarbonization is the only way through this mess. You may remember my talking about last May's International Energy Agency's report, which was really a landmark report that stressed the need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And here's the International Energy Association, long dominated by the fossil fuel industry, calling for, quote unquote, a total transformation of the energy systems. And it did make clear that the path to net zero was achievable, as narrow as it is. But it made clear also the annual clean energy investment globally needed to triple by 2030 to around $4 trillion a year. The 2022 report that was issued this past May did point out that clean energy investment is increasing, but not quickly enough to reach net zero emissions by mid-century, and that shortfalls were especially apparent in emerging and developing economies. The other thing I've looked at traditionally has been the extent to, what's the view of Americans on climate change, and the surveys from the Yale University are usually released in May, and here's what it looks like this year. Basically, it looks like about 7 in 10 Americans think global warming is happening, and that's been fairly consistent. Although I have to say, I was really struck by the fact that it's dropped since September 2021 to 72% this past April. But the good news here is that only 12% of Americans think global warming isn't happening. I kind of scratch my head at the notion that 15% say they don't know if global warming is happening or not. Kind of wonder where these folks are hiding out. When you look at the extent to which Americans are certain that global warming is happening, more than half of Americans, about 54%, are either extremely or very sure that it's taking place. And I think very striking that many fewer, about 7%, are extremely or very sure global warming isn't happening. So it's definitely sinking in here. But again, you see a drop from September to this April from 57% to 54%. And then you have to ask, what's causing this climate change, if in fact you're aware of it. And roughly half of Americans, a little more than half, do understand that global warming is mostly human caused. And about 1 in 3 think it's due mostly to natural changes in the environment, not caused by humans. So that's again another pretty significant drop here from September, from 60 to 56% in terms of the percentage of Americans that think global warming is mostly human caused. And here's the one that really baffles me. You can see from this bar chart that only 1 in 5 Americans understand that almost all climate scientists have found human-caused global warming is happening. Only 1 in 5. And so, what's it going to take, as the NOAA scientists said, to wake people up to the fact that this is human caused, and that the vast majority of scientists agree with this. I think what's really at the bottom of this is, I think, illustrated by this graph. And it's something I think we really need to understand. 2 out of 3 Americans say they rarely or never discuss global warming with family or friends. I'm not talking about here about a broader circle here of associates. We're talking about family and friends. Only 1 in 3 Americans are basically talking about global warming with their family or friends. And 1 out of the 3 say they only discuss global warming occasionally or often. And this is something we all really have to work on. Sharing what we know about global warming, and talking about it, because that's really the essential first step. And I think that's really what I see TCCPI being about. We're all, meeting together monthly and talking about these developments, and not just talking about them, but sharing what we're doing about it in terms of solutions. And I think that's really critical. So how about some good news? Dave mentioned some at the outset of this talk. One of the most concrete pieces of good news is the IRA that was signed into law by Biden earlier this month. That commits $369 billion in climate and energy investments. It is by far the largest such investment in U.S. history. What's interesting to me is the shift in approach here. Biden administration has decided to focus on, to put it in concrete terms, focus on carrots rather than sticks. IRA really focuses on investments in clean energy, mainly in the form of tax credits. In contrast to economists who've called for carbon taxes as to discourage fossil fuel use as a way to go forward. So basically, stepping way back from the notion of carbon pricing carbon, and saying, let's provide incentives to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy. Now, clearly, the IRA is much, much smaller than the Build Back Better Act that the Biden administration had introduced at the start of this discussion. It also includes pretty significant concessions to the fossil fuel industry to try to bring Joe Manchin on board, and that was really the only way this bill was going to get passed because of the narrow majority that Democrats have in the U.S. Senate. And even in taking this into account, the IRA is projected to cut U.S. emissions by 40% by 2030 when you compare it to 2005 levels. And the Biden administration had set out to achieve 50%. But this is definitely a step, a significant step in the right direction. I think one of the things that's emerged since the bill came into law, which really was just recently, a new report where economists are estimating Americans are going to save as much as $200 billion over the next decade in electricity bills, thanks to this bill. And I think what's significant here is that this clearly contradicts the belief that clean energy transition is going to be expensive. In fact, it's going to save Americans very significant money. The other thing that has been, I think, really not talked about enough, and actually I was pretty surprised by this when I dug deeper into the IRA. But there's a provision in the IRA that amends the Clean Air Act to define carbon dioxide produced by burning fossil fuels as an air pollutant. And why is this significant? Because the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on the EPA that said it couldn't regulate carbon dioxide emissions was based on the argument that there's been no formal claim by Congress in law that defines carbon dioxide as an air pollutant. And so this part of the IRA will allow the EPA to move forward in regulating greenhouse gas emissions. So very good news there. I think in terms of the big picture, that really the very best news is the accelerating pace of clean energy transition. And I know we've gone over time, and I'll wrap this up. But I just really want to hit on the fact that electricity generated by renewable resources in the US had a big wow moment in April, where 28% of the electricity was generated this past April by solar and wind and water. It was only 8.6% as recently as April 2021. And then when you take nuclear into account, almost 46% of US electricity in April came from sources that don't emit greenhouse gas emissions. Wind and solar installations absolutely make up the bulk of new power plants that have been added to the US grid in recent years. In the first 6 months alone in 2022, wind and solar made up 2/3 of the new US electrical generating capacity. No new capacity from either nuclear or coal in the first 6 months, and natural gas provided just under 1/3. US investments in clean tech had nearly quadrupled since 2017, and Texas, of all places, has increased its solar output 39-fold just in the past 6 years. When you take a look at the global renewables landscape, I think it's even better news. It's now renewables are the cheapest form of power, not just in the US, but in many, many other countries across the globe. Renewable energy production has grown 400% in the past decade. The first half of 2022 saw a record investment in renewables, $226 billion. That jumped 11% in the first half of the year compared to the same period in 2021. Investment in solar is up 33% and 16% wind. And China is really out in front here. It's invested $41 billion in the past 6 months in solar, and is followed by the US with $7.5 billion, in Japan at 3.9. China is also the leader when it comes to wind investment, $57.8 billion. The US investment comes in at $19.7 billion. So just again, to wrap up, what is it we're doing here, and why? And I think Katharine Hayhoe sums this up for me when she says that clearly scaring people about climate change, what Dave referred to as climate doomism, isn't going to motivate people to take action. If we don't have any idea what to do, the scary facts just paralyze us. And she talks about this in a recent book that she just published. That what does work is talking about how climate change affects us in the here and now in ways that are relevant to our lives today. What Hayhoe says, I think, is pretty vivid, is you can't talk about polar bears in Iowa if you want to get people on board thinking about climate change. And then once you do get people thinking about climate change by talking with your friends and family, then you have to look for solutions. And that's what's going to help people feel empowered and keep pushing for more change. And again, that's really what I see us doing here at TCCPI. And so with that, I'm going to stop the screen sharing. And I'm sorry that we went over. I wish we had had more time to talk about this, but we're certainly not going to stop talking about this. But that's the way the world looks right now. And I think it's absolutely sobering, even terrifying, but there are solutions, and they're not solutions that involve technology or financial approaches that haven't been created yet. So we do have to wrap up. But let me just see if anybody wants to ask a question here or help us think about this further.
Peter, I'd like to.
Dawn.
Oh, okay, thanks. I have a very general sort of large statement, which is, it sounds like the way that we're going forward and potentially the way that we're going to see some traction is to rely upon increased consumption. People, I'm just going to say, people like to buy things. And the incentives, of course, all have to do with purchasing. So I just want to sort of hear from folks. It was interesting. David Brooks wrote a book a while back, Bobo is in Paradise. And it was really about, it was people living in Bozeman, Montana, but the whole idea that sustainability and moving towards sustainability and transitioning, what kind of fuels we're using, it really had a lot to do, and the current situation that was written a while ago, 20 years ago maybe, had so much to do with, or the way people were responding was through consumption, buying new fuel efficient refrigerators. And I'm just wondering if that seems to be the way we're currently, or the administration and others is currently moving, and how we feel about that. Sometimes I myself think it's going to be the easier route, but there are, huge implications for that, and the secondary impacts, cost of production, natural resource extraction. So what do folks think? Is that where we are, and is that what we should support going forward?
Paul.
A lot of thoughts come up from your presentation. First, 1 in 5 is not too horrible for being able to make change. There's statistics that show that 5% of the population being committed to something will make it happen quickly. My big concern, like you, is that the timeline is unbelievably tight. So it's kind of interesting to talk about 2050, but useless, because if we don't do something by 2025, we're on an irreversible downward spiral. What Al commented about with a systemic perspective is the whole system has to be in the room, which means the people's emotions have to be in the room to be able to get them to be even present. So maybe we're going about this by missing a whole bunch of stakeholders at the table, like the young people in the schools, to be able to get them to have conversations with their parents, to get them to be excited about this, or maybe with what Dawn was it Dawn earlier? Yeah, saying that if there was a lot of examples of what could be done in, say, just the town of Ithaca or the city of Ithaca or Tompkins County, people would be able to taste the possibility, and then you could leverage out the cost benefit and use the carrot approach that Biden is using in the national scale to make things happen quickly. But there's got to be from my perspective, a leverage of action quickly to get people to be convinced that it's even possible. And that's where TCCPI, I think, is beautiful in that next step.
Yeah, I think that, the real challenge here is, as you mentioned, Paul, and as I talked about, is that we have to reach peak emissions by 2025. And here we are towards the end of 2022.
Right.
And, as an historian, I have to, ask, when's the last time in human civilization that people have made a conscious, intentional choice to dramatically change their lifestyle and
2022.
cut back on their consumption in the face of a obvious catastrophe headed their way? I certainly can't think of any. The main times when that has happened is when the catastrophe hits. So we really have to take a look at this and understand the extent to which, especially those of us living in the developed world, have a responsibility to take steps intentionally to reduce our level of consumption. But as Dawn has pointed out, part of how we're going to reduce our emissions is if we move forward to purchase, for example, more energy efficient appliances, or as Tony and others from that team talked about, carry out deep energy efficiency retrofits. So it's a real dilemma, and I think also it focuses attention on how we really need to focus on methane emissions in particular. As Bob Howarth has pointed out, methane is 80% more dangerous than carbon dioxide, but is a way, by focusing on containing methane emissions, a way to buy us time, essentially, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Al, and then
Yeah, just make a quick
we are going to
comment.
have to bring this to a close.
I agree with what's been said, but what I say is, as far as what Dawn said, definitely people like to buy things, but the main thing is, and I think it's very much underused, is life cycle analysis. So every time you put up a windmill, for example, you put up solar cells, there's a life cycle cost to both the mining, the manufacturing, et cetera, which can be traced back to carbon dioxide if you're using present day technologies. And I think, so buying new things should be put into that perspective. And I believe, but I'm not sure, that things like buying new refrigerators definitely do pay off in a life cycle analysis, because you can recycle most of a refrigerator and you can pump out the used Freon and things like that. But you get solar cells and all these other things. I think people have to really keep that in mind when they're buying something, whether they're actually buying something that will help save them money in the future, because your local utility paid for part of it, so it sounds good and everything. Whether it's really helping the world or not has to be figured out. I'd say, generally speaking, the large scale things like utilities paying for things have been thought out. But I do, retrofitting of buildings, is it really better to build a new building that's zero energy building rather than modifying an old building? There's a huge capital cost to that, but that's a good question to ask. Is this really the right way to do it?
Yeah, thanks, Al. And I think when you think about new construction, really paying attention to the carbon that's embodied in construction materials is really important. And I think that's one of the reasons why developing low carbon concrete, for example, is a really critical solution that's being explored. And I think, at the personal level, obviously, the extent to which we can significantly reduce our meat consumption. I mean, if cattle is one of the major drivers of methane emissions, that's something we have control over and can have a major impact on. And then the other one that I've thought about a lot personally is flying, personal travel. I've just basically pulled the plug on that for me, and that's true of our household here. It's just, and it's really striking to me the extent to which, for example, you see these climate and sustainability conferences that are basically generating thousands of miles of air travel instead of going virtual in the way that we have been here with TCCPI recently. Just very, very striking that even conferences on climate change are not really addressing this the extent that they should. But anyway, again, as I emphasized earlier, the solution is really to do what we're doing here, which is talking about the challenges of climate change and talking about what the solutions are, and then really supporting each other in taking those steps. And I think that kind of mutual support allows us to really move forward collectively, which is really the way we have to do it. You know, yes, there's steps we have to take as individuals, but if we don't engage in collective action, we're just not doing nearly enough. So with that, I hope in the face of these very, very dramatic developments that are occurring now, you know, I just really was startled by how the flow of material that I had to try to wrap my head around just in the last 2 months. This is unprecedented for me in all the years that I've been doing this. But I really do think it underscores the immediate challenge. So with that, I want to wish you all a great weekend. Really important, I think, that we recognize, acknowledge with gratitude how fortunate we are here in the Finger Lakes in terms of our weather, availability of water, you know, the access to local food systems and the like, and to not forget what the rest of the world is facing, and not to take for granted what we have. So everyone take care, and I'll see you. I guess the saying is I'll see you in September. So bye for now.